Okay, so today you're going to take notes on the last part of this ecology unit, which is food webs. So yesterday we talked about food chains, and I said that we can show a more complex food chain with a food web. So today we're going to focus on that. Okay, so like you learned yesterday, a food chain only shows one path for energy. On the top of your notes where it says draw the food chain, draw out this food chain here. Then I want you to label the producers, the first order consumer, the second order consumer, the third order consumer, and the decomposer if there is one. Take about a minute to draw it out and to label. You don't have to actually draw the organisms, you can just write their names. Okay, so hopefully you labeled the algae as the producer, the mosquito the first order consumer, the frog the second order consumer, and the lizard the third order consumer. Again, there's no decomposer in this food chain, and the sun is just there to show everyone that the energy is coming from the sun. Alright, I want you to think about these questions. Is a food chain a good model? Does it really show us what's happening in an ecosystem? Okay, hopefully you're thinking the answer is no. A food web is actually going to be a more complete picture of what really happens in nature. So look at this food chain here. We've got grass, we've got grasshopper, mice, and an owl. So think to yourself, do owls eat only mice? That's all they eat. Do mice only eat grasshoppers? Are there other animals that eat mice besides this owl? Are there other animals that eat grasshoppers? And then, are there other animals besides this grasshopper that eat grass? Okay, hopefully you're saying yes to all these questions. That's why a food chain, which shows just one link of organisms in an ecosystem, is not a good model for what's really happening. In fact, there's a lot of different feeding relationships in an ecosystem, and we really want to show that in a model. So to show that, we use a food web. Okay, so in most ecosystems, feeding relationships are much more complicated than a food chain. Each organism may be part of several food chains. So to show that, we use a food web. A food web is a network of interconnected food chains in an ecosystem. So you can look at this food web here. This one's actually pretty simple. If you look at it, it's kind of a combination of 3 or 4 food chains. Here is one food chain, from grass to vole to gray wolf. Here is another food chain, grass to coyote to gray wolf. Here is another food chain, grass to elk to gray wolf. We could keep going and see several other food chains. But what we've done here is connected all these food chains into one food web. This really shows what's happening in the ecosystem instead of looking just at one food chain. So populations in food webs are all connected. So because they're connected, a change to one population will change the others. So if I change the number of deer in this ecosystem, it is going to change how many trees there are. If I change how many mice there are in this ecosystem, it's going to change how many snakes there are, how many hawks there are, and how much grass there is. They're all connected. So let's think about this. Find a place on your notes to write this down. What would happen if all the mice died out, went extinct in this food web? Find a place on your notes to write down an idea of what would happen. Take about 30 seconds. Okay, so hopefully you noticed that the grass population would increase because they wouldn't have mice eating them. Hopefully you thought that the snake population would decrease because they wouldn't have any mice to eat. And then the hawk population would also decrease because they wouldn't have any mice to eat. You could also go a step further and think about how this would affect the frog. So if there's fewer mice, there's going to be fewer hawks because they don't have food. There are fewer hawks, there's probably going to be more frogs because they're able to reproduce and there's no predator eating them. So really start to think about how they're all connected. Okay, so in a food web, not all the energy at one trophic level is transferred to the next. So because it's not a direct link and there's a lot of different things going on in a food web, not all of the energy is transferred to the next organism. So organisms at each level have to use some of the energy that they take in to carry out their life processes. They also release some of the energy as heat. So not all that energy is eaten by the organism that eats the other one. So in reality, only about 10% of energy at one trophic level is passed to the next. So that means that organisms at the bottom, like producers, have the most energy. They're getting all their energy from the sun, they have the most energy. And organisms at the top of the food web have the least energy. That's going to be important for some of these questions. Okay, so let's do a few practice questions together. Looking at the food web on your notes, and it's also up here, you're going to answer the questions in the two boxes. Take about 3 minutes to answer those questions and then we'll go over them. Take about 1 more minute. Okay, so for the first one, what animals eat the mouse? Hopefully you wrote rabbit, wildcat, owl, and snake. What animals are eaten by the hawk? Oops. Okay, skip that question. Sorry, I should have said that at the beginning. Skip that question. We don't have a hawk. Except I think this kite over here is the hawk. So the snake is eaten by the hawk if you saw that as the hawk. Sorry, that was a weird one. Okay, what animals eat the goat? Hopefully you wrote lion and jackal. What animals are eaten by the wildcat? Hopefully you wrote rabbit and mouse. And then name the producer, this green plant right here. Name 2 consumers. You could pick any of these over here. So lion, jackal, wildcat, rabbit, any of those. Okay, so reading a food web is pretty similar to reading a food chain. A lot of the questions also tend to ask what would happen if the goat went extinct, or what would happen if the snake went extinct, like we practiced in the last question. Right now you're going to finish the rest of these practice questions on your notes sheet, and then you'll move on to making your own food web.